Excellent. So my name is Breno Braga. I am an economist at the Urban Institute, and I'm also a co-host or co-organizer of our SGE virtual seminar series. I'll be co-hosting the seminar with Mel and Aaron today. Before we begin, I would like to go over a few housekeeping rules. We'll take the first 5 to 10 minutes to introduce our seminar and our speaker, Paul, who will have then 15 minutes for his presentation. One second here. So after the 50 minutes presentation, we'll reserve the final 30 minutes for a Q&A session. During the presentation, please your microphones muted. For the Q&A session, you can raise your hand virtually, and then Aaron, who is co-hosting the seminar here with me, will call you by your name, and then you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Or alternatively, you can type your question or comment in the chat, and Aaron will read out loud to the speaker. Finally, if you're not an SG member yet, you can find more information about SG in our website here. You can find information about memberships too. Okay, so before I start, if you don't know SG, I want to advertise our society. SG supports the professional development of government economists and economists' interests in economics of public policy. We achieve this through many different activities throughout the year. We have monthly seminars like the one you're attending now. We also have our annual conference, which is often in April. We also have sponsored sessions at other conferences, such as ASSA, which I'll talk a little bit more in a second. And we also have many leadership opportunities for government economists and those interested in public policy. And we also have networking and mentoring events. So that note, I want to advertise that if you're interested in submitting a paper or panel to our SSA SG sponsored sessions, the deadline is today. To be considered for a session, at least one of the authors of each paper must be a member of SGE. And I invite you to visit our website to learn more about the submission process, which deadline is today. I also want to advertise our next seminar, which will be about the importance of central bank independence. And the seminar will be on June 11th. Stay tuned for more information on our website or via email if you're a member already. Finally, I want to say if you have ideas for more for other seminars, or if you want to present something, please contact our SG president, Christina Miller. And with that, I will pass the mic to Mel to introduce our speaker.
Okay, thank you, Breno. Dr. Paul Chinowsky is Professor Emeritus in Civil, Environmental, and Architectural Engineering at the University of Colorado Boulder. His research has focused on infrastructure and climate change since 2006. He originally developed adoption models to project how infrastructure adoption would occur in the area of transportation. He developed the Infrastructure Planning Support System, IPSS, to model adoption costs and approaches from an engineering perspective. He has worked with adoption teams on global, national, and local modeling efforts. The adoption analysis work by Dr. Chinowsky has been applied in over 50 countries. Dr. Chinowsky has been an author on both the IPCC and National Climate Assessment reports in the area of infrastructure. Dr. Chinowsky's work has been featured in media outlets across the country, as well as in the New York Times, NPR, CNN, and the BBC, as well as other international outlets. Professor Chinowsky received his bachelor's and master's degree in architecture from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo in 1987 and 1988, respectively. He received his PhD in civil engineering from Stanford University in 19 91. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Chinowsky. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mel. It's good to be here. Thank you for inviting me, everyone. I hope this is a timely topic in that, we talk about air travel a lot, and I want to talk about rail a little bit. It's something that's tends to be overlooked. We sort of take it for granted that we have rail travel. And so today I'm going to take you through really, is there something behind rail travel that we need to be concerned about, right? What is it about rail? And this is one of those topics that I was doing research on it, you really like topics where you find out things that you either go, wow, I didn't know that, or, that's interesting. This was definitely one of those, that's interesting as we were really looking at this. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And there we go. All right. So the talk is about the fragility of the national rail system to environmental conditions. And what I'm going to highlight is the fragility of this system. So here we go. So here's the topics. We're going to talk about a little bit of our history and dependence on rail. Again, we kind of forget how dependent this country is on our rail system. The fragility of the system, the economic impact, what does it actually mean from a dollars and cents perspective? Can we do anything about this? And what are the challenges? So let's jump in. And I'd start by saying this work was originally funded through EPA, through the Climate Change Office, as part of the Climate Change Impacts and Risk Analysis, the CIRA projects. And I encourage anybody, if you're really interested in infrastructure and the impact of changing conditions, I'll give you the web address a little later. It was done with two different consulting firms, Industrial Economics, it's based up in Boston, and Resilient Analytics out here in Colorado. The original report was done for the fourth National Climate Assessment and then continued into the fifth. So with that, let's talk about the history and dependence we have on rail. Everybody likes trains. It is one of those universal things where if you talk to people, very few people have something negative to say about trains. And our love affair with trains goes back centuries, really. It really goes back to the beginning of the trains in the 1800s. The first motion picture was about a train, right? Movies and stories have focused on trains, Murder on the Orient Express, right? Kids' books are about trains. You go on to do a search on the internet. There are more train books for every type of audience that you can imagine. And of course, even today, feature films have trains as the stars. I always say the people in it are kind of the support for the trains, which everybody wants to see. So we like trains. Why? Part of it is they are so intertwined with the history of the United States, right? This is 1860, right before the Civil War. And you can see how trains sort of map and follow what the population expansion was at the time. Kind of the upper Midwest, the Northeast, and a little bit down to the South, and everything pretty much stops at the Mississippi River. After the Civil War, we started building again, and we built the Transcontinental Railroad. Everybody who went to elementary school in the US will remember how we learned about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. and how it was westward expansion. And it linked in Promontory Point, Utah, was where the Transcontinental Railroad was. But what's interesting is you see, that was really the only line that went across the West, right? We really depended on one line. It was almost more symbolic than anything else. But in 20 years, by 1890, rail was really reflecting what the industry was in this country. The upper Midwest, the industrial heart, the Northeast, which was our real population centers. The South is beginning to grow out, and you're beginning to see the West. When we built the Transcontinental Railroad, there were really three options for building it. There was a northern, a southern, and a central route. Because of different issues, politics, geography, costs, we built out first the central route. Essentially followed the Oregon Trail for a lot of it. But by 1890, we also had the northern route and the southern route. I highlight this because it shows the difference once you get into the West, the plains, the West, you see how much less rail track we actually have. Now, this is 1890, okay? So I want you to keep these three routes in the back of your mind because they're going to become important as we go forward. By 1950, which was really the top expansion in the United States of rail before we started to contract it, what you see is really a densification of the rail. You don't really see a lot of expansion. In fact, in the West, we still only have these three major routes, right? The northern, the central, and the southern. Most of the rail expansion is occurring upper Midwest plains up into the Northeast, right? This is where rail really is. In the West, it's supporting. Now, what that translates to is we really, in the US, passenger rail is secondary. We don't ride the rail that much unless you happen to be in the Northeast. The Northeast corridor is where most of the rail traffic, passenger rail traffic is. As someone who used to live in Boston, I took the train every day, commuting in and out of work, right? But what you see, less than 1% of actual movement of people in the US happens in rail, right? Japan has some of the highest, 28% of miles traveled by people is by rail. The US is not a passenger rail country. We do have passenger rail, we have Amtrak, but in comparison, it's not the main use of rail in the US. And this is the Amtrak stations. And what you can see is it basically follows that. Lots of rail in the Northeast corridor. And this little highlighted area, that's actually the only rail that Amtrak owns, right? That is actually the only rail. All the other passenger rail, all these other little dots, that rail is leased or paid for by private companies, by freight rail companies. But again, what do we see? Northern, middle, southern, and a few routes down to the south. The US is dominated by freight when it comes to rail. We have about 140,000 miles of what we call Class 1 railroads. And when we talk about the railroads, that's typically what we mean. These are the big heavy freight railroads. These are typically when you're at a stop when the mile-long freight train goes by, those are Class 1 railroads. There are smaller ones, 22 regional, lots of local, those are your light rail. But when we talk about the rail industry, we talk about heavy freight industry. It's nearly an $80 billion industry. This is a big industry, moving goods. 167,000 jobs. This is a big economic driver that we have as the rail industry, moving freight. And I always say, people don't tend to think of freight as a big deal because we're used to things like overnight and 2-day shipping, air freight, small goods. But if you think of agriculture products are moved by rail all across the Midwest to the East and West. Heavy raw materials, coal, ore, all of these things are moved across by freight trains. Oil that doesn't have a pipeline, all of these things, cars. We talk a lot about ocean shipping, right? It's a big topic these days. What we tend not to do is stop and think about what happens when these things get to the port. There's 3,000 miles between the Atlantic and the Pacific ports. We've got to move all of this cargo. A lot of it goes by truck, but think of it, a truck moves one container. Rails move 100 or more at the same time. We are completely dependent on the rail freight industry to actually bring goods across the country. Now, we talk about Class 1 railroads. Surface Transportation Board actually defines Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3 based on revenue that the companies make. So the big freight haulers are Class 1. And that's where we really focus most of our focus on. Now, here's the big thing. This was when I was doing a research originally on this, I went, really? Roads are typically built by federal, state, or county governments. Roads are public. Rail, taking out that small amount that's owned by Amtrak, are owned by a handful of freight companies. They are private. The rails in the US are predominantly private, which means these companies are responsible for maintenance and improvement. And here they are. These are basically who runs the rail system, right? You see down at the bottom here, Amtrak only owns 1,000 miles. Their route covers over 21,000 miles because they use freight rail, but they're a very small owner. Union Pacific, BNSF, Canadian National, these are the big rail owners. This is different, completely different than any other type of transportation, in that most of the regulation historically on rail is very minimal. It's left to the rail companies to really determine when they're going to upgrade, what they need to do. And that really is the basis of where we're going here in terms of fragility. The other piece is, as these colors show, ownership of rails is regional. We really don't have the big transcontinental rail company. They're regional. And they have hubs, just like airlines, St. Louis, Chicago, You can see out in the west, San Francisco, but you have major hubs in the Midwest. And that's where we transfer, right? Rail, one company brings it to the hub, drops off the rail cars, picks up, goes back the other way, right? It's a regional system. It is a complete byproduct of 1860s rail development that we have lots of different companies, right? At the turn of the century, there were over 100 companies back in the early 1900s. And through consolidation, that's come down to these 7 big companies. And we say, well, why does that matter? Well, remember at the very beginning, I said we've got a few major rail routes. Today, 130 years later, we have the same routes. They haven't changed, right? They haven't changed. The main routes are still the same. In this one section, the upper Midwest, we have quite a bit of redundancy, meaning if there's one line that's blocked or goes down, there are other ways of doing this. As you move west, there's no redundancy, right? There's no redundancy. As you look north-south in the east, along the Atlantic, very little redundancy. We are a system of main trunk rails and smaller side rails. We don't have a lot of redundancy. We are dependent on these systems working. Okay, so that sets up where we are today. Why is this fragile? We've been this way for 130 years. It's worked okay up until now. Goods move. We have one of the best safety records in the world. Why is it fragile? It's fragile because most of the infrastructure was built well over 50 years ago. And it was built, key components of it were built based on what were the weather conditions, the environmental conditions at the time. Bridges were built with an assumption that flooding was going to pretty much stay stable. As long as we build the bridges over what our historical flood rates are, we're going to be safe. As long as the water doesn't move faster than what we expect, we're going to be good. Well, guess what? That's changing, right? Increased intensity in storms that we have seen over the last few years are leading to increased bridge washouts, right? A lot of that is a combination of the water getting higher, more rain, moving faster, so there was more intensity of the rain, and more debris. So the debris hitting a bridge at a high rate of speed, that bridge just crumbles. You also see the supports aren't made for that faster, higher water, and you get failures in the middle. So washouts are going to become more common. We also see erosion from large storms, right? Every time there's a large storm, crews have to go out, check the rails, check the rail bed, and repair to make sure that they are safe. So these things are happening. They're happening right now. But that's not the biggest concern, right? It is a concern, but it's not the one that's really the concern that we have to worry about from an economic standpoint. The concern that we have are sun kinks, rail buckles. They're called sun kinks. This little jog in the rail is a sun kink. It's a sun kink, a misalignment. How does this happen? Rails actually are not very flexible when it comes to dealing with high heat. High heat is a very dangerous situation for rails. And it is a concern throughout the country. And these are actual pictures. These are not Photoshop pictures. These are actual pictures of what can happen in high heat. We say, why does this happen? The simplest explanation, I'll give you a little more detail in just a second. I want think of it this way. Rails are initially laid in what's called a neutral temperature. It is kind of an average, a little warmer temperature, so that typically on most days, you won't have temperatures vary above or below that number by more than 30 degrees. Let's say 30, some people will say 40, but you're not going to get much of a variance. It's a neutral temperature. If it gets hotter than that, we really start getting some warm weather. Steel, whether it's in a building, whether it's on a rail, steel, when it gets very hot, gets soft. When it gets soft, it bends. That's what's happening to rail. It's getting hotter on a more frequent and extended basis than was anticipated. And when it gets soft, it starts to bend. Why? Let's talk about that. So here's a good, really like this diagram. There's a reference to it. You can see the animation. It's done really well. Here's your rails. Rails, the main focus of building rails is that they stay in place when you're running heavy rail cars over it, right? So rails are attached to sleepers, the horizontal part. They're attached and then have ballast, concrete or rock underneath. The goal is they don't move. Now, it's natural, as I said, for steel to expand. And typically, historically, we built rail in sections. And so when you hear that kind of clickety-clack, 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 those are the cars going over the little breaks between the sections. And those sections, about 90 feet or so long, right, roughly. That allows for a little bit of expansion to happen between the ends of the rails. The problem is people complained I was too noisy. And so we figured out how to make continually welded rails, longer sections, several hundred feet, quieter. But the longer something is, when it gets flexible, it wants to bend, right? I always say when I'm teaching classes, think of a spaghetti noodle, right? When a spaghetti noodle, before it's cooked, it's nice and rigid and it holds on. But the hotter it gets, it starts to cook, it wants to wiggle, right? Train tracks do the same thing. The problem is they are held in place, but they're expanding because they're getting hotter. The steel is expanding. And so you have this tension between holding it in place and it wanting to get bigger. So what does it do? It pops out. It deforms. It gets a kink. That kink is the steel expanding in the heat. I say, first of all, that should be, wow, I didn't know steel would do that. Yep, it does. The second problem is when that steel starts getting soft. And here's my one technical diagram. Everyone likes technical diagram. When you start running heavy rail cars over soft steel, that weight is pushing out. And it's going to cause that steel to deform even more. I always tell people, think of it as standing on sand, right? When sand is really packed in and you stand on it, you get very little footprint. It doesn't move a whole lot. But as sand starts to get wet, it softens. Same thing as steel getting heat. If you gently step on that sand, it starts to move a little bit. You get a footprint. If you run on that sand and you put a lot of force on your foot, you get a bigger deformation, more movement. It's no different with the steel. If you very gently go over that soft steel, you can minimally move it. But if you put a lot of weight and a lot of speed on it, it's going to start to really deform. It creates sun kinks. Sun kinks have caused more than 2,100 train derailments over the past 40 years, about 50 a year on average. We don't hear about those, right? It costs about $1 million per derailment to fix these. In other words, there's a lot more of these happening than we ever anticipated. So what do? Well, when it gets hot, we start inspecting rail. Now, remember, I said very early on, rail is different than anything else in that it's privately owned and very loosely overseen. There's guidance. Federal Railway Association prevents guidance on continuous welded rail plans. Their guidance is you must inspect your tracks when ambient air temperature is forecast to exceed 85 degrees. That's getting more and more often. After 7 days, consecutive days of temperatures exceeding 85 degrees, you have to inspect every day that's exceeding 95. We have to start inspecting our rails. Why? Because of this. This is what sits behind the problem. Rails, as soon as they start to soften, they buckle very quickly. There's not a lot of, oh, this is in between. They're going to fail. So we know that. We've known that for decades. We know when rail's going to fail. So what do? We slow down. We slow down. We try and mimic walking slowly over those rails. And so if you're going along, somebody can see when one's coming up. The problem is there's no federal rule on this. Each company sets their own slowdown rules, right? So Amtrak says you can go 80 miles an hour when it kicks in at 95 degrees. BNSF slows that down to 50 miles an hour at 85 degrees. Canadian, 65. CSX just says slow down 20 miles an hour. Union Pacific, 50 miles. Everyone's different. Now, think about that for just a second. Think about that if that was air travel and every airline could make up their own rules about distance between airlines, right? We have some problem here. Now, let me give you an example of what a slowdown order is. This is CSX. Between 1 p.m. and 7 p.m., when there's a slowdown order, theirs is 90 degrees or higher, or a change of 25 degrees or more, especially if the predicted temperature is higher than 85. We're going to slow down. Passenger trains must go 20 miles per hour below the maximum, but not slow down more than 40 miles an hour. Freight trains, 10 miles an hour below, but not slower than 30. So for example, if the usual speed is 59 miles an hour, you're beginning to get flashbacks to your high school algebra. If two trains are going, yeah, I get you. If the maximum speed were 45 miles per hour, under a heat order, you only go down to 40. You never slow down more than 40. You don't go down to 25. So each company has its own rules about this. Now, we know it's getting warmer. Historically, this is kind of what things look like on average summer temperatures. And when we think about those corridors, the Atlantic coast, it gets hot far south. Nothing really in that northern or middle, it's more the southern. But we can see temperatures are getting warmer, right? They're getting warmer. Atlantic coast, the mid area. And if we look at days over 95 historically, it's primarily in the center of the country, but it's expanding. It's getting hotter. It's getting hotter. When we bring back this map, and it's getting hotter right where these main areas are, the main routes. It's also getting hotter where our passenger train travel is. Is this a problem? Well, let's take a look. Let's take a look at the numbers. What's the economic impact of this? Well, to figure out the economic impact, studies did three things. It broke the country up into grids, looking at basically in line with where projections were, and said, given each individual grid, how many days, basically, how much time is there that's going to exceed these thresholds? And though during those thresholds, they're going to slow down to those guidelines. And that's going to tell you what's your delay minutes for each of these grids. And you say, how many days over the year are we going to have this condition? It's going to give us per year. And then what's the cost of that? The cost both in time to individuals, idling trains, waiting till they get to go. These are the cost of delays. Now, how many delays do they have now? Well, it's a little difficult to answer accurately, purely because freight companies are private. They do not have to publish how many hours of delay they've got. We do have Amtrak numbers, and we see Amtrak, about 30% of delays in 2023 were because of heat. About 1,200 hours of heat delays, which doubled from 2018. So high temperatures are one of the largest delays that we see in Amtrak. And since Amtrak runs over those major routes, we can kind of see as a baseline. And we can use that to develop a comparison also with freight. So here's what we have. This is cumulative. Baseline. We're already in an era of having delays. Some of the places that's common: Virginia, Arizona, California, light rail systems all over the West, Los Angeles. Here in Denver, we regularly have heat delays. It gets to the point where people stop taking light rail because it's not reliable. But historically, if you took the baseline, no changes, it's not getting any hotter than today, you'd have about $76 billion of delay minutes. If you look forward, and these are the different EPA models that they look at, that ranges. So this 4.5 is kind of a median increase. 8.5 is a high level. There's never any agreements with emissions. High level. Mid-level, you see anywhere from about 40 to $50 billion of increased delays. This is discounted at 3%. The higher end, this goes up, you're in the 50, 60 billion dollars of delays. And this happens very soon. Again, we're already seeing delays, but you're going to start seeing more and more of that very near over the next decade. And you can see the models essentially separate as you get further out. But we see every region having impact. The Northeast, the highest impact, getting into the Southeast. Again, those are those corridors. Cost per mile, we're in 100,000, the Northwest 600,000 per mile. This is a lot of costs. And when we graphically look at it, what do we see? We see that the main costs are in those big routes. We see that delays are going to increase going California to Chicago, up here, Washington and Oregon across a lot. And these are important routes because these are bringing from Canada down and then transferring it. Big traditional hubs, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, all of these hubs along the Northeast, New York, DC, Philadelphia, coming down to Atlanta, Dallas. All of these routes are going to have increasing delays. Now you throw in those intensity of storms. Now you have areas such as Kansas City, St. Louis, into Dallas that become very, very unreliable in terms of the impact of environmental conditions. we're going to get very soon to a point where just because really of heat, that between really June 1st and mid-October, we can't guarantee how long it's going to take to move goods. Now, this is going to have a huge impact on the agricultural industry. Think about trains full of sugar beets running from, let's say, St. Louis out to down south to Texas or to Georgia. That produce can only last for a certain amount of time. If it's delayed 5 or 6 hours each day, what are we going to do? We can change the hours of when we run. What are we going to do? And the question is, are there any solutions? Well, sort of. And let me say, this is a global problem that people are trying to figure out. We're not the only ones who are having this problem with rail. The difference is we have 140,000 miles of rail to figure out what to do. Sensors for heat seem to probably be the best solution. The idea that we're isolating where exactly on the track it's getting hot. So instead of putting a slowdown order over an entire area of, say, Eastern Virginia, we say the slowdown area is only, say, 10 miles. And we start reducing the amount of area. We do have to install sensors across all that track, but it's not just sensors. We need all the digital infrastructure that goes along with it to allow central hubs to see this. Another option that's being explored in Europe is Australia. Paint rails white to start putting coatings on them. It's a little more heat resistant. Does that work? It can work. It's been found in test areas that it works. However, how long the paint lasts before you have to redo it is questionable. It seems like in high traffic areas like light rail, you're going to have to do it every year. That's what they found in Italy that they've been doing. Well, you can't paint 140,000 miles of rail every year, right? It's just not practical right now. We haven't figured out how to do that. Are there other solutions? Some. The UK is exploring replacing current rail with rail that's more heat resistant. They're also exploring in both the UK and France resetting rail so it's got a higher neutral temperature. The bottom line is none of these solutions are inexpensive. Do they work? Modeling says they work, that you can save a lot of money if you do this based on delay minutes. This is economic modeling, right? This is looking at, well, if we cut down delays by X amount, it should work. Do we know if it's going to work? No. Everything right now is in testing. But at least it has promise. But there's a problem. The problem is, how do we incentivize the investment in new technology? How do we incentivize private companies to invest large amounts of money to try and reduce this? Or how do we get the federal government to start encouraging or regulating this type of investment? Right now, we haven't figured out either one, right? What that means is the system that we are so dependent on will keep getting more fragile. You'll see it, we're beginning of May. So we're about 3 weeks away from really seeing the slowdown orders. We're also 3 weeks away from hurricane season. We have less than 10 hurricanes roughly per year. But we pay a lot of attention to them because of the very visible damage. Rail, the damage is behind the scenes. If you're taking Amtrak, it becomes visible. An hour, 2 hours, 3 hour delay if you're going cross country. The freight system all happens behind the scenes. But it's only going to be behind the scenes for so long before those challenges get to a point that you can't ignore it anymore. The payoff is likely there to do things like sensors, but the commitment's large. And right now, we don't have a way that's practical to make that change happen. So we see this interlock. We depend on something that's very fragile. We're not sure how to actually incentivize it to make it work better. There is a payoff. We don't know how exactly far in the future that payoff is, but it's there. So we sit and we have a challenge. One that will continue to grow until we really take a hard look at this. So hopefully you've seen a little bit about why the rail system that we've depended on 170 years, it still works. It's the safest in the world, but it's fragile and it's going to continue to get more fragile. And with that, thank you. And I'll be happy to answer whatever questions you may have. Thank you.